The term social justice activist has today taken on a pejorative meaning which embodies the meaning of an individual who campaigns for social justice in pursuit of their own personal interests. The term was coined in the 20th century as a neutral or positive term for people who engage in social justice activism. However, during the 21st century, the term changed from primarily being a positive term to an overwhelmingly negative one. The term was associated with the so-called alt-right political movement, and its negative implications gained fame particularly among those of the left, which would eventually come to overshadow its original intended meaning. The term social justice activist in its intended context referred to someone who promotes socially acceptable rights that foster equality for all peoples, regardless of gender, religion, culture, skin color, or nationality. In today's video, we are going to be discussing someone who embodied the true meaning of a social justice activist, namely the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. There is no doubt that the Prophet Muhammad campaigned for social justice throughout his entire ministry, from the moment he became a prophet to the moment he died. He had one goal in mind: to ensure that equal justice prevailed in the community to its fullest, but not for self-aggrandization. In the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad is commanded to say to his interlocutors in chapter 42, verse 23, "Say thou, O Muhammad, I do not ask you for a reward for it, only that there should be loving kindness amongst kinship. For whoever conducts a good thing, we will increase it in goodness for him therein, as assuredly, God is indeed forgiving, merciful." Similarly, the Prophet Muhammad is again told to say in chapter 25, verse 57, "Say thou, I do not ask you for any reward for it, only that whoever wishes, may take a path to their Lord." Yet again, the Prophet is commanded to say in chapter 34, verse 47, "Say thou, I have not asked you for any reward for it, as it belongs to you. My reward is not save upon my Lord, as he is over all things, an eyewitness." Furthermore, the Prophet is commanded to say in chapter 38, verses 86 to 88, "Say thou, I do not ask you for any reward, nor am I of the pretenders. It is not save a reminder for the peoples, and you will certainly come to know of its report after a while." Similarly, in addition to not asking for a payment, the Prophet Muhammad did not at any time impose a taxation on people, as recorded in chapter 23, verse 72. "Is it that thou would ask them for a wage of taxation? For the wages of thy Lord are better, as he is the best of the providers." And in chapters 52 and 68, verses 40 and 46 respectively, the same is reiterated, namely that it was unbecoming for the Prophet to ever have asked for any reward for his ministry. "Is it that thou would ask them for a reward so that they are burdened heavily in debt?" As evidenced by all these verses, the Prophet Muhammad never asked for any reward throughout his ministry. We see that all he asked for from his people was, a. for them to maintain loving kindness amongst kinsfolk, b. for whoever wished, that they may take a path to their Lord, c. to seek the reward of God rather than the reward of people, and d. for people to be reminded of the end times, and that the Prophet was not a pretender in his ministry. Thus, from what we can learn from this honorable man, is that if we want to be true social justice activists, who truly care about establishing justice and equality within our societies, then our end goals must not be for self-aggrandization and appearance. Firstly, we must not ask for any reward for the work that we do in calling for social justice. This is because, as already evidenced by the book of Exodus in the previous scriptures, chapter 23, verse 9, which states, "You are to not take any gift, for the gift blinds the wise, and perverts the words of the righteous." Thus, taking wages for our causes will blind us and cause us to pervert our words, thereby rendering our endeavors null and void. When it comes to doing good, the Quran makes it very clear that whatever we do of any good, if it is done for acquiring God's countenance, then we will find it with God. Whereas whatever we do, seeking the rewards of men, then our works will be worthless in the eyes of God. It is my contention that God is the only neutral and central point around whom we can judge our actions, and without God, it would be certainly difficult for society to be virtuously unselfish in their attempts in establishing true social justice. The Quran contrasts this motif of being good for the sake of appearances with those who seek the life of the world, and those who seek the life of the hereafter. Those who seek the life of the world are understood as those people whose intent in whatever they do of good is the mere appearance of being righteous in the eyes of the people, but with no genuineness whatsoever in their hearts. Regarding these sorts of people, the Quran says in chapter 42 and 11, verses 20 and 15 respectively, "Whoever desires the harvest of the hereafter, we will increase for him in his harvest, and whoever desires the harvest of the world, we will give him from it, but he will not have any portion in the hereafter. Whoever happens to desire the life of the world and its adornments, we shall repay them their works in full therein, and therein will they not be depreciated at all. As it is only God who knows the contents of the breasts, we can never know whether one is doing a good deed for other than their own self-aggrandization. But because God knows that the human self is prone to exhibit selfishness quite often, he places himself at the center of which all good deeds should be rendered. Not because God is in need of the sacrifices of the human being, but rather because the human being by his nature requires some sort of anchorage to suppress his natural inclination towards selfishness, so God provides for him a way in which he can suppress that inclination, namely by rendering every good act to God alone, as human selfishness is a natural phenomenon from which the human being cannot escape. However, if the human being decides to not use God as an anchor to curb selfish behavior, then he will have to bear the turmoil that may ensue from that. Not to say that it is impossible, it certainly is possible, however, it is very difficult, especially if it is something that we would want for all peoples to do. One must not only think of themselves, rather ponder what that implication would mean on a grand scale. Not everyone is going to think alike, as people are very diverse, so if God is removed from the equation, it may have a ripple effect from whose downfall the world may never recover. We tend to only envision the bubble we live in as the only bubble out there, whereas there are certainly many bubbles, many worlds, and each society has its own world, so, accounting for all of them to act righteously or equitably, would certainly pose an almost impossible challenge without having an anchorage, namely a reason for why they should do as such, rather than act as they wish. People typically love to cite the Scandinavian countries for having such progressive values which are not based on God, but still are thriving, for which they argue, clearly shows that an anchor, or God as the anchor, is not a necessity in order to maintain order and still thrive as a society. However, this is a flawed argument in my opinion, as Scandinavian countries, though not using God as an anchor, still maintain a necessary anchor for their success, and that anchor is namely high taxes. Scandinavian countries have some of the highest taxes in the world, and this creates a ripple effect which trickles throughout the society on the backbone of a socially democratic framework, which in turn enables the society to maintain a feedback loop between the government and the people, basically meaning that whatever goes into the society eventually makes its way back into the government's hands in the form of high taxes. This form of unequal taxation ensures that the margin between the rich and the less rich does not become too wide that it is impossible to maintain, as we see in many of the less developed and more developed countries. So, to make a long story short, having an anchorage within society is a necessity to maintain social justice. However, substituting God for a non-God anchor has the downside that people will genuinely become less willing to do good for those who have little, as they will attribute the responsibility of taking care of the less fortunate to the government. Furthermore, people would see no value in their contribution to society when they don't willingly sacrifice that which they love for themselves. The Quran comments on this phenomenon in chapter 3, verse 92, which states, "You will never attain virtue until you spend out of that which you love, for whatever you virtuously spend of anything, then God is surely knowing of it." Thus, according to this verse, unless one is willing to freely spend out of that which they love, then they will never attain true virtue, which is defined as a trait of excellence in an individual, as it pertains to morality or intellect. And it is reserved for those, according to chapter 2, verse 177 of the Quran, who a. have faith in God, the last day, the angels, the divine dictum and the prophets, and b. the ones who give wealth, despite their love for it, to the near relatives, the orphans, the needy, the traveler, the beggars, and in the liberation of the slaves in captivity, and also the one who upholds the salat and gives the zakat, and the ones who fulfill their sworn promises when they make promises. According to this verse, these are the ones who are true, and it is such people who possess self-discipline and mindfulness. The sentence, the ones who give wealth, despite their love for it, is a very essential part of maintaining socially virtuous justice within a given society, as it speaks volumes in its implications. This same inference is reiterated in chapter 76, verses 5 to 10, which state, "Assuredly, the virtuous shall drink of a cup whose mixture is kafur, a spring of which the servants of God will drink, they will cause it to gush forth, gushing forth. They fulfill their vows and are fearful of a day whose evil will be widespread, and they give food, despite their love for it, to a needy person and an orphan and a captive of war, saying, We only feed you for the countenance of God. We do not want a reward from you, nor even any gratitude. We are merely fearful from our Lord a grim and distressful day." Once again, in this verse, we are treated to the core principle of being a social justice activist, namely, to not expect a reward from the people. Social justice activism should be done for only seeking the approval of God and not the approval of men. Selfishness is not wrong when done for seeking the approval of God, meaning that God recognizes the innate nature of the human being, that the human being needs a sense of appreciation or approval when they do good, a sense of feeling that their work actually matters. Yet the Quran here in these passages informs us that not even appreciation should be asked of the people who are being fed. Whether people thank you or not, this should not be the focus, rather the focus should be centered around God alone, that you are feeding people only as a way to attain God's approval. This does still maintain the actions to be selfish in a sense, but selfish in a virtuous manner, in a manner that will not eventually bear any consequences down the line. Many people who fight for social justice end up losing faith in their activism because they cannot help but notice a lack of change in the society, despite the large amount of work that they do, and that is primarily because the selfishness that they are working for is that which lacks virtue, meaning that they are doing so for immediate or worldly self-gratification. However, when one does good, knowing truly in their heart that they are doing so for the sake of God alone, not expecting a reward or appreciation from the people, and knowing that God is the appreciative, then they would never lose hope in the good that they do. Even when they do not see any change whatsoever in the good that they do, it would never discourage them, nor impede them in their endeavors. This is the custom of all the messengers of God prior to the Prophet Muhammad. Neither one of them ever asked for any rewards from their people, hence they never lost hope in their prophetic ministries, even when the majority of them were in fact rejected, bullied, persecuted, mocked, and some even killed. These were the true social justice activists, who gave their lives for social justice and fairness amongst the people, and it is by their example that we are to follow. In terms of what true fairness should be like, the Quran states in chapter 4, verse 135. O people of the faith, be those who stand up for fairness as witnesses for God, even if it is against your own selves or your parents or your near relatives. If there is one who happens to be rich or poor, then God should be the foremost of them both. So, do not pursue the desires and inclinations, lest you not deal justly. And if you distort or neglect, then God is indeed over whatever you do, ever acquainted. This verse lays out for us what true fairness should encapsulate, namely, that it should not be partial, and it should not favor one who is rich over one who is poor, even if it is against oneself or one's own parents and near relatives. Those who advocate for individual fulfillment and satisfaction would rather maintain a system in which one looks out for themselves and their close circles, whereas the Quran, and in extension the Prophet Muhammad, wanted equal and fair treatment of all individuals, regardless of social status. God should be the foremost of all, and so it is essential that natural desires and inclinations are not pursued in contra to dealing justly amongst people. Similarly, this concept is reiterated in chapter 5, verse 8, which states, "O people of the faith, be those who stand up for God as witnesses for fairness, and do not let the hatred of any people obstruct you from dealing justly. Deal justly, as it is closer to mindfulness. Be mindful of God, as assuredly, God is indeed acquainted with whatever you do." Here, in this verse, the people of the faith are encouraged to stand up for God as witnesses for fairness, and in doing so, they are not to let the hatred of any people deter or discourage them from dealing justly, rather, they are to deal justly, as this is closer to mindfulness. This means that, in being a true social justice activist, you will not help but meet people who will hate you and attempt to discourage you in fighting for what is right, but this should not be a reason for you to give up the fight for justice, even when the majority of the people might be in aversion. Whether it is dealing with transactions and contracts, as in chapter 2, verse 282, the Quran maintains that justice and fairness should be maintained, as it states, "O people of the faith, when you have contracted a debt to a known term, then write it down. Let a writer amongst you write down with justice, and let no writer refuse from writing down, as God has taught him." The justice meant in this verse refers to, a. the writing down of the contract itself, b. not leaving anything out of the contract, c. having witnesses, d. not refusing to witness or write when summoned, e. not disregarding anything, be it small or big, f. harming neither the writer nor the witness, and h. being mindful of God. These are of the requirements for a contract to fulfill the justice intended in the verse. Even though this is justice primarily between two parties, it can also be implemented socially. But, returning to the true meaning of actual social justice activism, namely, the promotion of socially acceptable rights that foster equality for all peoples, then the Quran echoes this through its very many verses pertaining to the treatment of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the marginalized, and the less fortunate people, which encapsulated the orphans, the needy, the poor, the slaves in captivity, the oppressed, and the war captives. In chapter 107, the Quran lays out what it calls the rejectors of the system of right conduct, and it reads, "Hast thou seen the one who rejects the system of right conduct? For it is the one who drives away the orphan, and he does not encourage the feeding of the needy. So, woe to those who make the salat, those who are heedless of their salat, those who are for show and who withhold even the simple act of neighborliness." Thus, according to this verse, someone who rejects the deen, a term which is typically translated as religion, is not someone who denies the existence of a God or one who is not convinced that a God exists, nor even one who does not follow the Quran. Rather, it is actually the ones who heedlessly make the salat that are the rejectors of the deen, as the salat is meant to encourage the feeding of the needy, to care for the orphan, and to show neighborliness. However, those who are heedless of the salat, do not understand that the salat cannot be correct unless it encourages these sorts of things. They merely do the salat for the sake of appearances, to attract notice and attention from others. I have chosen not to translate the word salat, as this is a topic for another day on which I will make a video, safe to say that it is in fact a specific kind of practice in my understanding. Similarly, in chapter 104, we are told of the one who scorns and criticizes, yet he has wealth which he gathers and counts. The chapter states, "Woe to every scornful person, one who criticizes, the one who gathers wealth and counts it, thinking that his wealth will make him immortal. Nay, he will surely be tossed in the crasher, but what will make thee know what the crasher is? The fire of God, ignited, the one which rises upon the minds. It will surely be upon them, closed in extended columns." Yet again, in chapter 90, we are told of the steep and difficult path, as well as what it entails going down this path. In the chapter, we are likewise told of a man who sees himself as invincible just because he has been given an abundance of wealth which he spends in large amounts. The chapter reads as follows, I surely do swear by this city, and by you who is free of this city, and by the male begetter and what he has begotten, that we certainly did in fact create the human being in toil and hardship. Does he seem to presume that no one will gain dominance over him? He says, I have done away with wealth in abundance. Does he seem to presume that no one sees him? Did we not assign 2 eyes for him, and a tongue and 2 lips, and we guided him to the 2 ways? But he has not tackled the steep and difficult path, and what will make thee know what the steep and difficult path is? It is the setting free of a slave in chains, or the feeding on a day of severe hunger, an orphan of near kindred, or a needy person covered in the dust of misery, and then being from among those who have faith and who advise one another in patience and advise one another in compassion. Such people are they who shall be the companions of the right, whereas those who have denied and suppressed our signs, they shall be the companions of the left. Upon them shall be a fire, closed in. The state of the human being when it comes to administering social justice is furthermore elaborated in chapter 89, verses 15 to 20, which state, So, as for the human being, when his Lord puts him to trial by honoring and being generous to him, then he says, My Lord has been honorable to me. Yet when he puts him to trial by restricting his provision for him, he then says, My Lord has humiliated me. Nay, but rather, it is because you do not encourage the feeding of the needy, and you consume the inheritance, devouring entirely, and you love wealth with an immense love. This concept of consuming the wealth of the orphan, and consuming the wealth of the people through bribery, is one which the Quran is unequivocally against, as shown in chapters 2 and 4, verse 188 and verse 10, respectively, which state, And do not consume your wealth amongst yourselves in falsehood, nor pass it on the down low to the judges in hope that you may consume a portion of the people's wealth in sin while you know. Assuredly, those who consume the wealth of the orphans wrongfully, they only consume a fire into their bellies, and they will be exposed to a burning flame. According to the Quranic system of justice, in chapter 59, verse 7, the wealth that comes into the community belongs to none but God and the messenger, and to the less fortunate. Whatever God has restored to his messenger from the inhabitants of the towns, then it belongs to God and to the messenger, and for the near kindred and the orphans and the needy and the traveler, in order that it does not only circulate between the rich among you. Whatever the messenger gives you, then take it, and whatever he prohibits you from, then refrain, and do be mindful of God, as assuredly, God is indeed severe at retribution. According to this verse, the reason for the wealth to be divided amongst these groups of people, is in order that the wealth does not merely circulate among the rich. This verse outlines the receivers of the wealth that comes into the hands of the community. First, the wealth belongs to God and to his messenger, meaning, since God and his messenger function as the governing body of the community, the wealth is first and foremost in their hands. And then once that has been established, then the messenger divides and allocates the wealth to the needy, the orphans, the near kindred, and the traveler. From this, we can understand that the wealth is meant to be in support of the less fortunate in the community, rather than to individual people. Some might misunderstand the phrase, to God and to the messenger, thinking that the messenger could take some of the wealth, but this is not the case. The verse merely mentions this to establish the governing body in the society, namely, God and the messenger. Note the preposition, to, attached to both God and the messenger, and then the same preposition for all the following groups of the less fortunate people. This is meant to infer that the less fortunate are the recipients of the wealth, and the messenger merely distributes the wealth in a just and fair way, hence why the verse says, Whatever of the wealth that the messenger gives you, then take it, and whatever he asks you to refrain from taking, then refrain from taking it. This is because the wealth was gathered in a particular place, and the messenger would distribute it to the people accordingly, and he would prohibit them from taking whatever they wanted of it without regard, just because they happened to have been fortunate enough to be in the first rows of the battle. The Prophet Muhammad campaigned for the rights of the oppressed, the orphans, the needy, the poor, the slaves and the captives. This was the legacy that the messenger left behind for us to emulate. Unfortunately, however, we have greatly fallen short of this mission, and have instead pursued traditions which have taken us away from the message of the Quran, traditions whose main focus is not caring for the orphan and the needy, and not setting free the slaves in chains, nor feeding the captives. Instead, those countries which we have typically associated with Islam, have been instrumental in promoting some of the worst atrocities in human history. Another marginalized group whose rights the Prophet Muhammad campaigned for, was namely that of the females in the society. This included both the young and the adult females. As for the young females, then it was a custom among some of the people in the society to bury their daughters alive, due to shame which they felt they had brought upon their families. The Quran states the following in chapter 16, verses 58 to 59. And when one of them is given the tidings of the birth of a female, his face turns dark, and he becomes one who suppresses great grief. He hides away from the people because of the horridness of the tidings which he was given, thinking, should he retain it despite the humiliation, or should he bury it in the sand? Undoubtedly, however, evil indeed is that which they decide to do. Similarly, this same sentiment is reiterated in chapter 43, verse 17, which states, and when one of them is given the tidings of that which he himself attributes to the Supreme Divine Sovereign as an example, suddenly his face turns dark, and he becomes one who suppresses great grief. Furthermore, this action is condemned as an action of foolishness and great loss in chapter 6, verse 140, which states, those who killed their children out of foolishness and without knowledge have indeed lost, and also because they forbade that which God has provided them, inventing a fabrication against God. They have indeed gone astray, as they never were guided. And yet again, in verse 137 of the same chapter, the killing of their children is attributed to the associates whom they assumed, based on their superstitious beliefs, that they would lead them closer to God. The verse states, in like manner have the associates of many of the associators beautified the killing of their children to them, in order to turn them back and to confuse their way of life for them, but had God willed, they never would have done it, so leave them be, O Messenger, and whatever they fabricate. Thus, according to this verse, the killing of one's children is not something that God could ever command or endorse, as it was merely a ploy by their associators to turn them away and lead them into utter confusion with regards to their deen, meaning their way of life or system of conduct. God's system of right conduct could never encapsulate the killing of one's own children unjustly. One may raise the point of Abraham and his son in this case, however, this was never a command given by God to Abraham, but this is not a debate for this video. Perhaps, someday, I may make a video on this subject. But returning to the subject of infanticide, the Quran, furthermore, relates how this act will be one of the acts that people will be held accountable for on the day of resurrection, as told in chapter 81, verses 8 to 9, which state, and when the little girl who was buried alive is asked, for what sin she was killed. This was one of the most egregious crimes that the society of the Prophet were committing, so when the Quran labels them as unfaithful ingrates, or foolish, or wicked, or wretched, or when it calls for fighting them until the deen in its entirety belongs exclusively to God, female infanticide is one of the major reasons for why the Prophet had to campaign against these sorts of people, even when it resulted in warfare. These weren't mere traditions and customs which were at the back of the minds of the people, rather they were dear traditions to these people, and they were firmly engraved in their way of life, hence why the Prophet had to campaign against them, to the point of the sword. Some crimes are just too egregious to be ignored. In my opinion, this act on its own warrants a violent response, should admonition prove non-beneficial. When people claim that the Prophet Muhammad was a violent man for the campaigns that he carried out during his ministry, it should be noted that these are the actions that they say he should have ignored and let be. As for women, there is a popular belief among ex-Muslims and people of the anti-Islam agenda, as well as the Islamophobes, that the Prophet Muhammad was in fact anti-women, or that he limited the rights of women. This, however, is without any evidence whatsoever. Typically, people would quote verses such as chapter 4, verse 34, which is understood to address the striking or beating of women within the confines of a relationship by the husbands. But this is not so, according to my understanding of the text. I have already made a video on this verse, so I will not go into the details about this issue in this video. Similarly, people tend to cite the verses pertaining to inheritance to prove their point, mostly not even understanding what is being discussed in those verses. I have already made an in-depth video on this issue as well, so there won't be any need to repeat the same points here. However, one point that I would like to raise on this issue would be, why does the Quran allocate anything to women at all, if the intent of the Prophet Muhammad was to limit women's rights of inheritance and to suppress them from anything good? This is a very important question to ponder, for those who claim that the Prophet Muhammad was out to subjugate or oppress women. People whose intent is to oppress others, does not typically involve giving them half of the inheritance, which, mind you, is a common misunderstanding. Another question would be, why does the Quran, and in extension the Prophet Muhammad, even allow women to be witnesses at all? Why not ban them indefinitely from ever testifying, or say that their testification is not valid? Why equal their testification to that of men in the Quran? Yes, equal, and I am very familiar with verse 282 in chapter 2, which people who do not understand tend to gravitate towards, when they want to promote lies about the Quran. Even in that particular verse, the testimony itself is between one man and one woman, not one man and two women, as traditionally supposed. I have likewise made a video on this issue, please go and watch it for more details. But back to my earlier point, why did the Prophet Muhammad not limit women entirely from testifying, similar to the way it was practiced in Rabbinic Judaism? Why not maintain that same tradition, if the intent was to suppress and subjugate women? In terms of divorce, the men who divorced their women, were instructed to either retain them or let them go, with what? In what manner were the men obliged to let go or retain their wives? In an oppressive or suppressive way? Come, let us hear your responses, if you possess any credibility. The verses pertaining to divorce are mentioned in chapters 2 and chapter 65, particularly in chapter 2, from verse 227 to 242, wherein the Quran lays out the guidelines on how divorce should be conducted. Show us anywhere in those verses, wherein men are given the license to mistreat or oppress their women, O ye who lack intellect. On the contrary, the exact opposite is in fact mentioned, as clearly seen in verse 231, which states, when you men have divorced women and they have reached their term, then you may retain them in good conscience or release them in good conscience, but do not retain them with the intent to do them harm, so that you thereby transgress, for whoever does that, then he has indeed wronged himself. And do not take the signs of God in ridicule, but commemorate the favors of God and what he has sent down upon you of the divine dictum and the wisdom, by which he admonishes you. And be mindful of God, and know that God is of all things, knowing. In this verse, retaining or letting go of one spouse after the term has been reached, was to be in a way that is acceptably good, a way that is known and agreed upon to be appropriate by both parties. The verse even tells us that if one is to retain their spouse, then they were not to do so with the intent to do them harm. Similarly, in verse 239, release is said to be in such a way that is to be excellent. So, let the fool then tell us, where does excellent treatment refer to oppression, suppression, and subjugation? The verse states as follows. Divorce is twice, so it should be either retention in good conscience or release with excellence. And it is not permissible for you men that you should take back anything of that which you gave them, except if they both fear that they would not be able to maintain the boundaries of God. Likewise in the verse, it is not permissible for men to take back anything of that which they gave to their wives during their marriages, unless both parties, the man and the woman, fear that they will not be able to maintain the boundaries of God as it pertains to what was freely given. Again, if the intent was to subjugate and oppress women, why not tell men to request all that which they spent on the woman to be handed back to the men? Or why even give them anything at all to start with? Once again, we are told in verse 232, pertaining to what the proper etiquette should be when divorce has been finalized. The verse states as follows: "And when you have divorced women and they have reached their term, then do not deter them from remarrying their spouses when they have mutually agreed amongst themselves in good conscience. That is admonished of the one among you who happens to have fidelity to God and the last day. That is finer for you and more pure, as God knows, whereas you do not know." We ask ourselves again the same question in this verse: what exactly was Muhammad trying to achieve, when he told the men that when they had divorced women, and those women had reached their term, that the men weren't allowed to deter these women from marrying other husbands, if they had mutually agreed amongst themselves in good conscience? Was he trying to oppress these women, as ex-Muslims and Islamophobes claim? Or perhaps something in opposition to the mistreatment of women? Tell us, you who claim to understand, but yet have no intellect to reason. What about in verse 236, which states, "There is no blame upon you if you are to divorce women whom you have not touched, or for whom you have made an obligation. But do compensate them with an enjoyment, on the one who is vast in means according to his capability, and on the one who is restricted in means according to his capability, an enjoyment in good conscience. It is a duty upon the doers of good." Here, in this verse, the Prophet Muhammad informed the men that there would be no blame on them if they divorce women whom they had not touched sexually, nor those whom they had allocated an obligation, meaning those whom they had promised that they would give them a certain amount as the bridal gift. There would be no blame on them for changing their minds and deciding on not going ahead with the marriage. However, they were obliged to compensate them with some sort of enjoyment regardless, even when they had not touched them. Once again, we ask ourselves, what exactly was Muhammad's intent here? Was it to subjugate women by letting them be compensated, even when the marriage did not go ahead, and they did not have relations with one another? Why even the concern that the women should be compensated? Why not simply say, "Leave them, you have nothing to do with them," if the intent of the Prophet Muhammad was to bring mistreatment to women? Let us know, you who lack the intellect to put two and two together, if you possess any credibility. In fact, in the following verse, half of that which was promised is supposed to be paid to the bride, if the man divorces her without having had relations with her. Once again, we ask, why even care at all? Why allocate anything to the women, if the intent was to be ill-mannered towards them? There is nowhere in the Quran, where the term, good conscience, is more prevalent than when it comes to the treatment of women. In verses 240 and 241, pertaining to the widowed women and divorced women, the Quran says, "Those men who die among you and leave behind spouses, should leave a bequest for their wives in the form of something valuable till the yearly revolution, without expulsion. Then when they do in fact exit, there is no blame on you in whatever they do concerning themselves in good conscience, as God is the one with the authority, wise. And for the divorced women as well, there should be something of value, a right upon those who possess discipline." In these verses, the Quran mandates that when a husband dies, and leaves behind a wife, then he has to leave a bequest for his wife in the form of something valuable till the yearly revolution, meaning that he has to leave something which the woman is going to use for the year, without having them expelled from the homes. So, here, the Prophet Muhammad is instructing men to make sure that their spouses are well looked after their husband's demise, for a whole year, meaning that what is bequeathed to the wife, should be something which they can rely on for a whole year. And again, we have to ask, what was Muhammad's intent when he instituted this law? Why the constant care for women's well-being, even after the husband's deaths, if the intent of this honorable man was to subjugate and oppress women? Let us know, you who lack the mind to reason. Their claims are nothing but mere accusations which they bring up but are unable to substantiate them with any evidence whatsoever from the text of the Quran. On the other hand, let us observe how women were viewed in the society in which the Prophet Muhammad was living. We have already seen that daughters were not particularly favored in the community, so now we are going to see whether those lucky women who managed to grow up into adulthood, favored any better. According to chapter 6, verses 138 to 139, we are informed of how the perception of women was in the society in which the Prophet Muhammad was proclaiming his ministry. The verses state as follows. And they say in their assertion, these livestock and cultivation are banned, none should eat of them except those whom we wish, and their backs are forbidden for riding. And there are other livestock, upon which they do not mention the name of God, a fabrication against him. He will soon requite them for that which they used to fabricate. And they also say, that which is in the bellies of these livestock is exclusive for our males, and it is forbidden upon our spouses. But if it happens to be dead, then they are sharers of it. He will soon requite them for their ascriptions, assuredly, he is indeed wise, knowing. Thus, according to these verses, pertaining to the livestock and the cultivation, we are told that on some of the livestock, they placed a ban and made it illegal for people to consume, except those whom they approved, as well as certain animals which they forbade from being ridden. All this, they did as a fabrication that they made up against God. They claimed, in support of their practices, that God has indeed instructed them in these assumptions. Furthermore, when an animal was pregnant, they would allocate its consumption to the males in the society but would forbid it for their spouses. But if the animal happened to die, then they would allow women to partake in eating it. There is a similar practice among certain African tribes, where when a group goes out to hunt, they divide the meat according to that which men may eat, and that which women may not eat. These kinds of practices which foster gender segregation and discrimination as it pertains to the provisions that God has provided for his servants, God did not send down any authority pertaining to them, and similarly in the aforementioned passages, God did not command them any such thing, yet it is what they invented and attributed to God. And such is the same when it pertains to practically all the ramblings that they attempt to smear the image of the Prophet Muhammad. If the Prophet Muhammad was in favor of discrimination against women, why did he not just pick up the position as the one mentioned in the verse? Why did he feel the need to point out the idiocracy of such a division? What did he have to gain from telling the people that this practice was idiotic, namely, to say that this animal is fine for women to consume, and that animal is forbidden for women to consume? Where is this so-called discrimination of women that those who lack any common understanding point to, when they accuse this honorable man of having perpetrated a discriminatory attitude towards women? There is a reason why the Prophet Muhammad only had daughters, rather than sons, as attested to by the Quran. There is wisdom and purpose behind that occurrence, but those who disregard the truth in favor of lies, just do not use reason. The Prophet was to stand in opposition to the beliefs and the practices of the society, which held that male children were superior to female children. If God had viewed males as being superior to women in his sight, then surely, he would have granted the Prophet Muhammad a son, rather than 4 wonderful daughters as held by the tradition. The messenger was to function as a modal example for all those who expect a return to their Lord, so change had to start with him and no one else. The fools among those who do not use reason, merely sit in the comforts of their homes with their laptops, pinning lies and fabrications in their feeds, defaming this honorable man with accusation which they cannot substantiate, and yet they claim to actually possess intellect. They are no different from those whom the Quran speaks of in these verses, people who do not reason, merely followers of the groupthink mentality, without a mind of their own. Certainly, the Quran did well in speaking out against them, when it said, "They have eyes with which they do not see, and they have ears with which they do not hear, they are like cattle, nay, they are even further astray." For someone who looks at these verses, and still claim that the Prophet Muhammad had some sort of personal vendetta against women, or that he was interested in suppressing women's rights, is at best, misinformed, and at worst, ignorantly insolent, period. There is so much that can be said on the topic of women in the Quran, that if I were to list everything that the Quran says about women, this video would never end. As such, I will close this video here, and thank those who were willing to sit through this entire video, and those who continue to watch my videos, however long-winded some of them might be. Thank you again for subscribing to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.